I feel led to give an epilogue on my Samson series, and this is called What Samson Began, and it's part 13. And I'll quote, "For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head. For the child shall be a Nazarene unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." Judges 13:5. And then a New Testament verse which seems to complement it. "Being confident of this very thing, that he which began a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ." Philippians 1:6. We are told that Samson would begin the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines. Now, by the end of the story, Samson lay dead in a heap of rubble, crushed along with the 5 lords of the Philistines and 3,000 worshippers at the feast of Dagon under the destroyed temple of Dagon. The 5-fold head of the serpent was seemingly crushed, as the primal prophecy of Genesis predicted. "And I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Genesis 3:15. But the Philistines would remain in charge of Israel and even extract more death, humiliation, and even terror from them for years to come. What Samson did was only the beginning of the deliverance. Philistines would defeat Israel in battles to come. They would present giants to taunt and profane Israel's worship, and they would raid and plunder Israel for years to come. But God, in his mighty and merciful providence, had already prepared for the complete deliverance of Israel. It turns out that Samson was a contemporary of the high priest Eli, which shows you the state of ministry in Samson's day. Eli, through a set of miraculous circumstances, would be presented with a small child to serve in the sanctuary with him at Shiloh, named Samuel. Now, when Samuel was just 8, the Most High woke him up and had a conversation with him about the house of Eli and the spiritual state of the nation. Imagine that the only one whom God would talk to on that level at that time was an 8-year-old boy. Samuel would commence the deliverance of the Philistines that Samson began, but in a different manner than Samson. He would become a factor in the spiritual revival of the nation through his faithful preaching, prayer, and ministry. In his tumultuous times, he would witness the turning over of the Ark of the Covenant of God to the Philistines by the high priests, and a political movement which would reject him and his priest sons as leaders in favor of a king. But Samuel prayed for the people and preached the truth to them, faithfully eventuating in something like a revival of true faith in the God of Israel. Overlapping the ministry of Samuel is the story of a wealthy farmer named Boaz, who allowed 2 poverty-stricken widow gleaners to work in his fields at harvest. He fell in love with the younger, named Ruth, and married her. She was a foreigner, a Moabitess, who had converted to God. They married and bore a son named Oved, and he had a son named Jesse, and he had a son whom he named David, who would become the king. You see, who would have guessed that when the Philistines actually captured the Ark of God, the earthly throne of God in battle, that it would not lead to their triumph, but to the utter destruction of Dagon and his civilizational stranglehold over Israel. When all looked to be lost and the holy enterprise, which was the theocracy of Israel, seemed to have failed, God tirelessly worked, laying the foundation of the complete destruction of Philistia and the deliverance of his people. Evil never triumphs. It only appears to for short seasons. You see, who would have guessed that out of the tragedy and hardship of Naomi, who actually changed her name to bitterness, something beautiful would come out of it. King David and eventually the Messiah. David and Solomon would wipe out the Philistine menace and eradicate their stranglehold over Israel completely by the grace and power of God. You see, Samson only began to deliver Israel. God knew all along his own plan and who he would use to carry it out, and the ups and downs of those chosen but oh so human vessels. I wanted to end this series on Samson by reminding us that quietly but powerfully, God works, often in secret, to accomplish his purposes. Who knew that something good could come out of the corrupted priesthood of Eli and his sons? We worship the same God today in these trying times. His power isn't limited, and his mercy endures forever. Let us take heart, everybody, in these dark times, and let's regain our faith, hope, and love, as the church has often done in olden times, by the Holy Spirit. Oh, may God give us revival and reformation. Jesus is Lord. Shalom.